In 1988, EPCOT Center opened its final country to date in the World Showcase part of the park, inviting visitors to explore the culture and customs of the country of Norway. But in addition to the shops and restaurants the new pavilion had to offer, its opening brought with it a first for Epcot, the park's first thrill ride, Maelstrom, taking guests on a trip to the land of Vikings, trolls, and oil drilling. A successful ride when it first opened, but also one that perhaps didn't live up to its original plans. A rushed dark ride full of strange moments, and honestly, quite scary animatronics for a ride at Disney World, and an attraction that was eventually left to fall victim to one of Disney World's most successful rides ever. Maelstrom may now be long forgotten, but what it does still have is a very deep and interesting history of failed theme park plans and lost pavilions dating back to the very beginning of Epcot and even long before. So having just made my video on SeaWorld's scary boat ride, Journey to Atlantis, I decided I wanted to take a look back at the scary boat ride of the park next door, and uncover the history of Epcot's Maelstrom. On October 1st, 1982, the 21st century began. Well, not really, of course, but that's how Disney put it in the advertising for the grand opening of EPCOT Center at Walt Disney World in Florida, the company's newest theme park. In part, as Disney described it, a permanent World's Fair, centered around educational attractions, housed inside pavilions dedicated to future technologies and cultures around the world. The new park was split into two halves. The front half was named Future World, the space for those future technology pavilions, and the back half of the park held the tribute to the countries of the world, named World Showcase. Much like the World's Fairs that had inspired it, Epcot's World Showcase held individual pavilions for each of its participating countries. Restaurants, exhibits, rides, and shows, educating guests about each nation. At opening, World Showcase hosted pavilions for Mexico, China, Germany, Italy, Japan, France, the United Kingdom, and Canada, with a final American pavilion named the American Adventure to serve as the centerpiece. World Showcase, though, was always designed to have more. In very early promotional films from the mid-70s, back when plans for Epcot Center envisioned it as two large buildings, Disney showed off concepts for more countries not seen in 1982. Places like Brazil, the Netherlands, the Soviet Union, and one pavilion referred to at the time as the Scandinavian countries, a room in the World Showcase wing of 70s Epcot to host all the countries within the region of Scandinavia, planned to feature a show on a ship named the Ferryboat Theatre, taking guests through Scandinavian fjords. By the end of the decade, Epcot had been reimagined as a more typical theme park, and the Scandinavia Pavilion had scrapped its Ferryboat Theatre in favour of waterfront buildings resembling the city of Copenhagen and a Norwegian stave church. In order to fund the construction of the countries of World Showcase, Disney had turned to corporations from each country to sponsor their respective pavilions, and around this time, they entered into negotiations with a number of Danish companies, primarily holding meetings with world-famous toy company LEGO, and concept art from 1979 shows the disappearance of the stave church as the Scandinavia Pavilion instead became solely Epcot's Denmark Pavilion. But in 1982, Denmark had not started construction, and alongside several other planned countries, it was pushed back to a Phase 2 expansion of the park. In 1984, Epcot finally opened its first new country, Morocco, the first pavilion to be funded by a government sponsorship. And around the same time, the Denmark plans had once again morphed back into a broader Scandinavia pavilion, now with a consortium of potential sponsors from Denmark, Sweden, and Norway. However, in 1985, the Danish and Swedish companies would drop out of the project, leaving only a group of Norwegian companies, alongside some support from the Norwegian government, still interested in funding the pavilion at EPCOT Center. And so finally, instead of a Denmark or even Scandinavian pavilion, Disney decided that World Showcase's next pavilion would be themed to the country of Norway. The new pavilion was to be built in an empty plot of land between Mexico and China. Back in 1982, Disney had been so confident about the Denmark plans that they'd actually already built a restroom building with Danish-inspired architecture in the space, and so the rest of the new pavilion would have to be built around it, with the hopes that the average guest wouldn't be able to tell the difference between a Danish and Norwegian building. Beyond the shops, restaurants, and slower educational attractions typical of the rest of World Showcase, Disney also saw an opportunity with Norway to improve EPCOT's offerings. Perhaps an initiative somewhat motivated by the modernization efforts of Disney's new CEO, Michael Eisner, it was decided that Norway would bring with it EPCOT's first thrill ride. During the mid-80s, a team of Disney Imagineers, including future lead designer of Animal Kingdom, Joe Rohde, would take several trips to Norway to document its architecture, culture, and help inspire the new attraction. One of the things they found themselves enamored by on their trips was Norway's folklore, particularly the stories of trolls, and the wooden carvings of the creatures they encountered across the country. And one of Disney's first designs for the new ride would be a boat trip through Troll Country. However, when the Norwegian companies sponsoring the pavilion saw the plans for the attraction, they complained about the idea of depicting Norway just as a land of trolls. They wanted the new ride to serve as a sort of tourism ad for the country, and feature the sights of modern Norway, not just a loose fantasy setting. And so the design would have to be modified to find a middle ground between Disney's ideas and what the sponsor was after. The attraction would remain a boat ride, but would instead take guests on a journey through Norway's history, from the era of the Vikings through to the modern day. The ride still needed more than just a typical flume drop of a regular boat ride to make it worthy as EPCOT's first thrill ride. And so it was suggested that partway through, the boat could suddenly be sent backwards through the ride, an element that would make the attraction unique at the time. The trolls would manage to stick around too, with Disney hoping to integrate them into the ride's big twist. And to cement the tourism ad desires of the sponsors, it was also decided that the attraction would end with a short film about life in modern Norway. The new design was thankfully approved, and the Norway Pavilion would be officially announced in 1986, as construction began. Signs in the park would advertise the pavilion as Norway, Gateway to Scandinavia, still leaving options open for further expansion. Over the next 2 years, Norway would slowly take shape on the banks of the World Showcase Lagoon, and at the back of the pavilion, Disney would get to work building EPCOT's most thrilling attraction yet, a boat ride that they named Sea Venture. On June 3rd, 1988, the Norway Pavilion would be officially opened by the then Crown Prince of Norway in an elaborate dedication ceremony broadcast live on Norwegian TV. And after 2 years of construction, guests could finally get a look at the pavilion's restaurants, shops, its stave church, its Danish restrooms, and plenty of wooden trolls. But what Norway wouldn't open with, however, was Sea Venture, as technical issues encountered during testing had forced Disney to delay its opening until later in the summer. Back in March, for reasons never officially confirmed, Disney would also change the name of the attraction. This had been done so late into development that the Sea Venture sign had already been installed, and so it was very quickly replaced with a sign carrying the new name for the ride. Maelstrom. The subtitle of the ride's sign was also changed for some reason. The original sign said "A Magical Voyage Through Norway," but the one the ride opened with would instead say "A High Seas Norwegian Adventure." But with the name changed and the technical issues seemingly resolved, on July 5th, Maelstrom would open, and guests would be invited to take a ride aboard EPCOT's newest attraction. The first sign of what lay in store for guests aboard Maelstrom would happen outside of the ride, as at the back of the pavilion, they could see a waterfall emerging from a hole in some rockwork, and through it they could spot the boats of the attraction moving past. Entering the ride, guests would first walk through a fairly basic queue line adorned with Norwegian flags, arriving in a large room housing the ride's loading area, and its defining feature, a striking mural painted on the far wall. An original concept by Joe Rohde for the mural focused on the country's natural landscape. A small fishing village sat against mountains, forests and fjords, transitioning to a vast night sky. But with the requirements of the sponsor, the mural that ended up making it to the attraction would instead choose to focus more on the people of Norway, placing them against the landscape, showing their history from the Viking era to the modern day, with vignettes of maritime life, alongside hints of the themes of the ride guests were about to embark on. Also hidden in the mural, keen-eyed guests could spot a Viking wearing Mickey ears. In the loading area, guests would board Viking longships and set off into the darkness ahead. First, their boat would climb a lift hill, as they would see the Norse god Odin welcome them with a solemn warning that Norway was a place of both beauty and danger. Then they would arrive in a Viking village to learn about the origins of the country, as they'd see animatronic Vikings and more longships on the horizon. After leaving the safety of the village, Odin would tell guests about the mysteries of Norway, and the boat would enter Troll Country, the remaining element of the original plan for the ride. A dark forest where they would come face to face with a three-headed troll, yelling at guests for entering its territory. The boat would come to a stop in front of the troll as it loomed over them, and a large water troll named Anukken would emerge from under the water next to the boat. The three-headed troll would cast a spell on the guests and command them to disappear, and here would be the ride's signature moment, as the boat started speeding backwards through a secret second route. The sky would light up above the boat as it exited Troll Country and entered Norway's far north, where additional animatronics of polar bears and puffins would look on as guests raced towards their unseen demise. The trolls' voices could be heard again, and behind them, they would see that they were heading straight for the waterfall they had initially seen outside the attraction. They could get a brief view outside towards the rest of the pavilion, but before they could plunge over the edge, a second water troll would appear as their boat changed direction, moving forwards again towards the North Sea. This would be the finale of the ride, as guests would go down Maelstrom's flume drop, emerging into a nighttime storm in the North Sea, and passing under a huge scale model of an oil rig, part of the sponsor's desires to promote Norway's industry. Wind and rain would batter the boat, and lightning would strike the oil rig. Now, the lightning itself is actually the subject of some debate, as some fans claim that in the attraction's early years, this effect was achieved through the use of, incredibly, a Tesla coil, used to generate real lightning. However, a write-up by one of the Imagineers who worked on Maelstrom, Paul Torrigino, claims that while the Tesla coil was tested inside an Imagineering workshop, it was never implemented, because Disney couldn't figure out how to safely use the effect without, electrocuting the people on the water ride. In any case, the boat would continue to crash through the North Sea and finally move on to the unload station, a beautifully designed modern village harbour, much more decorative than the loading area, with a small sailing boat moored up and sound effects of seagulls and distant ships playing around them. Back safely in modern Norway, after their encounter with the trolls. This would be where the ride experience itself would end, and guests would leave their boats and head into a theatre to watch the short film made as part of the tourism ad requirements, named The Spirit of Norway. Once the film was over, guests could then exit back into the Norway Pavilion to officially end their experience of Maelstrom. As a thrill ride, Maelstrom may seem pretty tame by today's standards, but being the first ride of this sort in the entire park, and being several years before the likes of Splash Mountain would show up elsewhere at Disney World, it was a fresh, more exciting experience than guests to EPCOT Center were used to. And the ride enjoyed a relatively successful opening in World Showcase. That being said, the early version of Maelstrom did still have a number of limitations. One of these was that the ride was just very short. During planning, the expectation was that Maelstrom would be 15 minutes long, putting it on the longer side of Disney boat rides, around the same length as It's a Small World. Budget cuts would soon cut this runtime in half. A disappointment, but still a decently sized attraction. Now about the same length as Mexico's boat ride, El Rio del Tiempo. However, when Maelstrom was being installed, it was discovered that the boats actually moved much faster than expected through the scenes, and the physical limitations of the ride system meant that they couldn't be slowed down enough to reach this new runtime. And so the final product wasn't 7.5 minutes, but barely 4. And when combined with the fact that the ride was trying to juggle its original troll storyline with all of those additional elements the sponsors had asked for, it did mean that the boat ended up rushing through multiple unconnected scenes without much opportunity for guests to take them in. Another issue was in the North Sea finale. Designed to be the main thrill factor for Epcot's first thrill ride, it turned out that the storm was maybe a little too aggressive. According to an article from legendary Disney historian Jim Korkis, when the ride first opened, guests would often get completely soaked after the drop, with one Norwegian TV reporter even being thrown out of the boat entirely. Although this issue was very quickly fixed, and there are no other reports of anyone taking a swim in the North Sea. In the unload station, guests were also made to wait around for the Spirit of Norway film to finish and reset before they could enter the theatre. According to some articles, the Spirit of Norway was originally supposed to be a pre-show, but at the last minute was moved to the end of the ride, providing a clunky, dull epilogue to what would have otherwise been a climactic finale. And the last one isn't so much of a limitation, more of just a general issue, but that troll animatronic was pretty terrifying. I think if I want to make the comparison with my last video about Journey to Atlantis, Maelstrom as a whole was never quite as scary as that ride, but considering this was a ride that many families went into, expecting it to be typical of a family-friendly Disney attraction, it did provide a pretty shocking moment for plenty of young kids.
Invaders! Stop! This is troll country! Get away! Be gone! I have the scent! Yes! Yes! You disappear! 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 Ah!
Horrifying. But most of these limitations didn't have a significant impact on the ride. The average guest wasn't aware of the original plans for the ride or the effects that were cut. And as far as the sponsors were concerned, Maelstrom was a huge success. According to that same article by Jim Korkis, Disney were receiving 150 requests a week from guests seeking more information about traveling to Norway. But the success of Maelstrom and the wider Norway Pavilion wouldn't last forever. And as the 90s approached, the ride would find itself very quickly left behind by those same sponsors. In 1992, the consortium of Norwegian companies that had initially invested in the pavilion sold its investment back to Disney. The Norwegian government did continue providing financial support to the pavilion, paying $200,000 a year. but a significant amount of its backing had suddenly disappeared. In 1994, EPCOT Center would receive a major update that included an overhaul of Spaceship Earth, a replacement of Future World's Communicore with the new, flashier interventions, and even a name change for the park. And the same year, Disney would make yet another attempt at the Denmark Pavilion, creating a new design inspired by the country's Tivoli Gardens, a pavilion they still hoped would be sponsored by LEGO. However, once again, the Denmark Pavilion would fail to get off the ground, and the promise of the gateway to Scandinavia would be all but forgotten. Very little would change from here on out for Maelstrom. In 1999, the ride would no longer hold the position of Epcot's only thrill ride, as Disney would open Test Track, taking guests through a vehicle proving ground as crash test dummies. With ride vehicles travelling over 60 miles an hour, Test Track was Disney World's new, fastest ride ever. And by comparison, Maelstrom didn't seem like much of a thrill ride at all. But despite this, it still managed to remain popular at the park at the end of the decade. Wait times were still relatively high, the trolls were still terrifying, and the Spirit of Norway was still mind-numbingly boring. But in 2002, the Norwegian government would decide to stop funding the Norway Pavilion, ending its 14-year relationship with Disney. Now Disney would be the only ones to fund its maintenance and any future updates. And with no one left to push for the tourism aspects of the pavilion anymore, it was clear that changes were imminent. By the mid to late 2000s, Epcot was undergoing yet another series of changes. Some of the first major additions under Disney's new CEO, Bob Iger. In 2005, the land's Food Rocks attraction was replaced with the motion simulator Soarin', and in 2007, two of the park's existing attractions would receive significant overhauls aimed at incorporating more of Disney's IP into the park. The whole of the Living Seas Pavilion in Future World would be transformed into the Seas with Nemo and Friends. And in the Mexico Pavilion, the boat ride El Rio del Tiempo, which had opened with the park in 1982, was refurbished into Grand Fiesta Tour, starring the Three Caballeros. And with that ride in particular, a long-standing boat ride with no IP, being updated to add recognizable Disney characters, fans started turning their attention back towards the sponsorless trolls of the boat ride next door. Disney did make some changes around this time in Norway too. In 2005, the pavilion's table service restaurant introduced character dining, bringing Disney princesses to its breakfast experience. And in 2008, a Viking longship which had been added to the country in the late 90s was demolished. That year too would bring a slight change to Maelstrom itself, as the doors to the Spirit of Norway Theatre were left permanently open, finally allowing guests to walk straight through after disembarking. But remarkably, even as Disney changed everything else around it, Maelstrom would survive. For now. The ride was still one of Epcot's most popular, so this could have prevented Disney from adding Mickey Mouse with Viking horns. Actually, they did do that already, but just as a pin. But it was more likely that Disney were just waiting to find the right IP to replace it with. In late 2013, Disney was gearing up for the release of its newest animated film, Frozen. In preparation for this, in October, a new temporary meet and greet would open at Disney's Hollywood Studios, featuring the movie's main characters, princesses Anna and Elsa. Once Frozen had released, the characters were due to relocate to the Norway Pavilion, the closest resemblance Disney World had to Frozen's vaguely Scandinavian setting, where they were due to remain for the foreseeable future until the movie's popularity inevitably died down and Disney would move on to promoting its next production. In November, Frozen would release and become the 5th highest grossing movie of all time, and Anna and Elsa became the world's biggest celebrities for those in the 10 and under demographic. In fact, the movie was so successful that Disney World seemed completely unprepared. Merchandise was rushed onto store shelves with strict purchasing limits, and Disney World hurriedly planned a new sing-along show for Hollywood studios to open as part of a Frozen Summer Fun promotion to take place in summer 2014. And in Norway, that new meet and greet, sandwiched between the Fjording gift shop and the Kringler bakery, drew so much demand that wait times regularly went as high as 4 hours. The temporary queue placed outside its entrance snaked throughout the entire pavilion, crowding the entrance to Maelstrom. In April 2014, to ease congestion in Norway, Disney would move Anna and Elsa to the Princess Fairy Tale Hall attraction in Magic Kingdom, a purpose-built meet and greet location with queues kept out of walkways. And wait times for that attraction immediately shot up to 3 hours. It didn't really matter anymore what state Maelstrom may or may not have been in. Frozen was practically begging for its own ride. Plus, Frozen did have trolls. Just maybe a lot less intimidating than the ones on Maelstrom. It was obvious what was about to happen. In September 2014, less than a year after Frozen took the world by storm, Disney announced that Maelstrom would close to make way for a new attraction based on Frozen. They also announced a new meet and greet specifically built for Frozen characters would arrive at the Pavilion too, to be built where the Viking longship had once stood. And so, on October 5th, 2014, Maelstrom held its final day of operation. Construction of the new Frozen ride would take a little under 2 years, opening on June 21st, 2016, under the name Frozen Ever After. Outside the ride, the opening in the waterfall was sadly never restored, with additional rockwork added to cover up where it had been, although the change was still obvious to anyone who remembered Maelstrom. Inside the building, Disney had finally prepared for the Frozen crowds by tearing out the entire Spirit of Norway theatre and replacing it with the ride's extended queue, much more detailed than the old Maelstrom queue, winding through Arundel's harbour and the Wandering Oaken trading post from the movie. As a result of the change, the load and unload station were now in the same area, and the beginning of the ride was slightly extended. However, the rest of the ride from the lift hill onwards used the exact same layout as Maelstrom. The iconic moment where the three-headed troll sent the boat hurtling backwards was now replaced with an animatronic of Elsa doing the same thing, and the arrival into the North Sea was now a splashdown back into Arundel Harbour. Some fans did criticise the changes brought about by Frozen Ever After. Frozen wasn't set in Norway. It was just set in a Norway-esque place, and questions were raised about whether tearing out something that was designed to be culturally representative of the country in favour of a ride about a Disney movie was really in the spirit of World Showcase. Others lamented yet another loss of something even moderately scary at the Disney parks, completely eliminating any thrill the ride had left. But this small amount of criticism didn't do much against the fact that the ride was absurdly successful with guests, particularly with families with young children, reaching a similar 3 to 4 hour wait time as the meet and greets had done, with opening day wait times going as high as 6 hours, a level of popularity Maelstrom had never received during its 26 years of operation. In the 2020s, Frozen Ever After would be brought to Disney's international parks as well, in Hong Kong Disneyland and at the newly renamed Disney Adventure World in Paris, opening as part of entire Frozen-themed lands. In early 2026, one of the key criticisms of the ride in EPCOT was also addressed, as the projection-mapped faces of the animatronics that had been used since opening were replaced with more typical physical animatronic faces. Today, Frozen Ever After's wait times have settled to slightly more manageable levels, now sitting below the likes of Guardians of the Galaxy Cosmic Rewind. But it still remains one of EPCOT's most popular rides. There are, of course, still plenty of remnants of Maelstrom present on the ride though. As well as the layout following almost the exact same routes, the boats are the same Viking longboats from before. The sky effect when the trolls sent the boat backwards still exists in Elsa's scene, and several puffin animatronics survived the redo and can still be seen on the ride. Beyond that, the ride's queue also has a handful of nods to Maelstrom, such as a carving of a polar bear, similar to the one in the Far North scene. The Norway Pavilion as a whole, though, has largely become a frozen pavilion, with its two biggest attractions, the ride and meet and greet, being tie-ins to the movie. There are still some things that represent the actual country, but they're much smaller elements than what was originally built in the 80s. Lastly though, there is one final element to the wider story when it comes to the inclusion of Frozen. Frozen is a movie inspired by the Hans Christian Andersen fairy tale, The Snow Queen. Hans Christian Andersen, the Danish author. Somehow, the Denmark Pavilion returned. Maelstrom, to me, occupies an interesting point in the history of EPCOT as a whole. It represents this transition period between the heavily educational, corporate-sponsored attractions of the original park and the more thrilling, spectacle-based attractions of the modern one. It's often considered a little too modern to be part of classic EPCOT, but still one of the older attractions. It's an example of Disney Imagineering trying to do both cultural education and exciting thrills. And it succeeded in some ways, but certainly fell short in others. I last rode Maelstrom in August 2014, right before its closure was announced, and I consider myself quite lucky to have got to experience the ride right as it was going away. I have an appreciation for Maelstrom, but I don't really consider it to be one of Disney World's best defunct attractions. It was way too short, and its story was just a little too rushed to rank it that high. And while I don't like the idea of turning a real country in World Showcase into a fictional one, I do think that with that aside, Frozen Ever After probably is an improvement over the original ride. What are your opinions on Maelstrom? Did you ever ride it? What did you think about it? And how do you feel about its replacement? Let me know in the comments. I hope you've enjoyed this look back at Disney's forgotten boat ride. If you're in the mood for more stories about theme park boat rides, my last video was on SeaWorld's journey to Atlantis and the tragic decline of that ride. But also the most recent video on my Patreon was a look back at 3 knockoff theme park attractions from around the world, including one really interesting Pirates of the Caribbean style boat ride. So if you're interested in signing up for Patreon to get access to monthly bonus videos, you can check out the link in the description. Other than that, if you're new here, please consider hitting subscribe, as there are always more videos about theme parks coming in the future, and as always, I'll see you next time.